Jung discovered something in his clinical practice that most therapists still refuse to acknowledge. Financial struggle isn't always about skill, effort, or opportunity. Sometimes it's about consciousness itself. Between 1913 and 1928, Jung documented a pattern among his patients that revealed 5 distinct psychological stages people move through when their awareness outgrows the economic systems they were born into. What terrified Jung most wasn't the struggle itself. It was discovering that most awakened people get permanently trapped at stage 3, suspended between 2 realities, unable to retreat to unconsciousness, but too wounded to move forward into sovereignty. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you understand your relationship with money, work, and survival itself. Jung uncovered that financial awakening follows the same archetypal pattern as psychological individuation, the journey toward becoming who you truly are. But here's what makes this discovery so disturbing. Each stage requires you to betray something your nervous system was trained to protect. Your childhood survival code, your family's money stories, your culture's definition of success. All of it must be confronted and consciously chosen or consciously rejected. Most people cannot tolerate this level of psychological honesty. They retreat, they numb, they get stuck. But before we explore these 5 stages and the shadow forces that keep you trapped between them, I need to ask you something that might reveal where you are right now. Have you ever felt guilty for wanting more money, or guilty for having it? Have you sabotaged opportunities right when they were about to pay off, or found yourself chronically undercharging even though you know your work transforms people? Drop a number in the comments, 1 through 5, based on which stage you think you might be experiencing. Don't overthink it, just your gut instinct. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what Jung discovered about stage 3, the stage where most conscious people remain trapped for years or even decades, could be the missing piece that finally allows you to break through. Share this video with anyone who's ever said, "I'm good with money, I just can't seem to make enough of it." They need to understand it's not a money problem, it's a consciousness problem, and consciousness problems require psychological solutions, not financial advice. Jung's framework emerged from observing patients who came to him, not for traditional psychological complaints, but for what he called spiritual emergencies disguised as practical problems. These were people who appeared functional, educated, articulate, but who experienced mysterious blocks around income, career advancement, or building sustainable businesses. What Jung discovered shocked him. Their financial struggles weren't about external circumstances. They were about internal conflicts so deep that money became the battlefield where their psyche fought for integrity against systems designed to extract compliance. Stage 1 begins long before you have conscious awareness of what's happening. Jung called this stage unconscious compliance, and it's characterized by a specific psychological signature. You're making money, possibly good money, but somewhere deep in your body there's a quiet sense of dying. Not dramatic, not urgent, just a slow erosion of something essential that you can't name and don't have permission to grieve. In stage 1, your persona, the mask you wear to fit into social and economic structures, completely dominates yourself, the deeper organizing intelligence that knows who you actually are. Jung observed that people in stage 1 can be extraordinarily successful by conventional measures. They climb corporate ladders, build impressive resumes, earn respect from family and peers, but beneath the performance, their bodies keep score. Chronic tension, mysterious illnesses, sleep disruption, emotional numbness. These aren't failures of discipline, they're symptoms of a psyche in rebellion. What makes stage 1 particularly insidious is that the people around you celebrate your compliance, your family is proud, your colleagues admire your work ethic, your bank account provides evidence that you're doing everything right. But Jung discovered something that modern psychology still struggles to accept. Financial success built on psychological betrayal creates a specific kind of suffering that cannot be medicated, motivated, or manifested away. Your unconscious knows you're trading your soul for security, and it will make you pay in symptoms until you listen. Here's what Jung observed about stage 1 that reveals why this phase can last decades. The economic systems we inherit are designed to reward unconsciousness, the person who asks no questions, who follows protocols without examining their ethics, who sacrifices their body's truth for quarterly targets. That person receives consistent reinforcement. Promotions, bonuses, social approval, all of it flows toward compliance. Your nervous system learns that consciousness is expensive and unconsciousness pays the bills. Think about the last time you sat in a meeting where you knew something was wrong but said nothing. Maybe the strategy would harm the end user. Maybe the marketing stretched truth into deception. Maybe the workplace culture rewarded performance over people's actual well-being. You felt it in your chest, that tightness, that voice saying this isn't right. But you calculated the cost of speaking and the cost of silence, and silence won. That moment, that specific choice, is stage 1 consciousness. You're awake enough to feel the wrongness, but not yet awake enough to risk the consequences of naming it. Jung documented that people in stage 1 often develop what he called compartmentalization strategies. You tell yourself that work is just work, that you can maintain your integrity in your personal life while compromising it professionally. You create elaborate justifications. Everyone does this. I'm just one person. I can't change the system. I need this job to pay for the things that actually matter. These aren't lies exactly. They're survival strategies your psyche develops to manage the cognitive dissonance between who you are and what you do for money. But here's where Jung's insight becomes devastating. The compartmentalization never holds. Your psyche is a unified system. When you betray your truth in one arena, that betrayal leaks into every other arena. The numbness you cultivate to get through work meetings shows up in your intimate relationships. The cynicism you need to tolerate unethical practices infects your ability to hope. The chronic low-level anxiety becomes the background noise of your entire existence. Stage 1 isn't sustainable. It's simply the stage before the breaking point. Most people remain in stage 1 until something breaks. A health crisis that forces them to examine the cost of their lifestyle. A layoff that reveals how little loyalty the system actually had for them. A moment of clarity, often at 3 a.m., where they suddenly see with terrible precision that they've built a life that looks successful but feels empty. Jung called these moments psychological emergencies, and they mark the beginning of stage 2. But before we explore what happens when stage 1 collapses, I want you to notice something about your own experience. If you've ever felt that quiet erosion I described, that sense of dying inside while appearing functional outside, write stage 1 in the comments. Not to judge yourself, but to acknowledge what Jung understood. This stage isn't a personal failure, it's a systemic design. The economy runs on unconsciousness, and your discomfort is evidence that some part of you refuses to fully participate in that unconsciousness. That refusal is the seed of your awakening, even when it feels like a curse. Stage 2 arrives as a crisis, but Jung understood it as something far more precise. He called this stage the awakening crisis, and it's marked by a specific psychological shift. Money stops making sense. The logic that governed your financial decisions in stage 1, work hard, get paid, achieve security, suddenly reveals itself as a story you've been telling to avoid a deeper truth. The truth that you're not designed for this kind of compliance, that your psyche has needs no salary can meet, that the price of your participation has been too high, and you can't sustain it anymore. What makes stage 2 so disorienting is that it often looks like failure from the outside. You start missing deadlines. You can't muster enthusiasm for projects that once excited you. You find yourself unable to perform the emotional labor that made you successful in stage 1, the smiling, the networking, the pretending that you care about metrics that measure everything except what actually matters. To your colleagues and family, it looks like you're giving up. But Jung understood something crucial. You're not giving up. Yourself is finally demanding recognition, and it will sabotage your persona's performance until you listen. Jung documented specific symptoms that mark stage 2 consciousness. You become allergic to certain kinds of work environments. The fluorescent lights, the performance reviews, the meetings about meetings. All of it triggers a physical response that feels like your body is rejecting the environment, the way it would reject poison. You find yourself drawn to content about alternative lifestyles, digital nomads, passive income, anything that promises escape from the structure that's suffocating you. You start sentences with "I just need to find something that feels meaningful," but you can't articulate what meaningful actually means, because you've spent so long performing someone else's definition of success. Here's where stage 2 becomes psychologically dangerous. The people around you, especially those still operating from stage 1 consciousness, will pathologize your crisis. They'll tell you you're being unrealistic, that everyone hates their job, that you just need to find better coping mechanisms, or adjust your perspective. They mean well, usually, but they're speaking from a level of consciousness that cannot comprehend what you're experiencing. You're not depressed, though you might meet diagnostic criteria. You're not lazy, though your productivity has collapsed. You're in the middle of what Jung called a psycho-spiritual emergency, where your psyche is demanding integration, even if that integration costs you everything you've built. Stage 2 is where most people make one of 2 catastrophic mistakes. The first mistake is retreating back to stage 1. The discomfort becomes unbearable. The financial pressure mounts. The people around you apply enough pressure, and you convince yourself that the crisis was just a phase, a burnout, a moment of weakness. You go back to the job, the lifestyle, the persona performance. But here's what Jung observed about people who retreat from stage 2. They never fully return to stage 1's unconsciousness. They're now consciously betraying themselves, which creates a suffering far more acute than the unconscious betrayal of stage 1. They know what they're doing, and they're doing it anyway. That knowledge becomes a psychological wound that rarely heals. The second mistake is what Jung called spiritual bypassing disguised as practical planning. You leave the oppressive job, but instead of doing the deep psychological work stage 2 demands, you jump straight into building the alternative. You start the business, launch the creative project, pursue the dream, but because you haven't integrated the wounds that created your stage 1 compliance, you simply rebuild the same patterns in a new container. You become your own oppressive boss. You recreate the same exhausting hustle under the banner of following your passion. You find yourself just as stuck, just as depleted, but now without the salary or structure that at least provided external stability. What makes stage 2 so crucial in Jung's framework is that it's the stage that determines everything that follows. If you use this crisis to do the actual psychological work, examining your childhood money wounds, confronting your family's financial stories, integrating your shadow around power and visibility, then stage 2 becomes the foundation for genuine transformation. But if you try to skip the psychological work and jump straight to practical solutions, you enter what Jung called the most dangerous stage of all. Stage 3 is where Jung's observations become both devastating and essential. He called this stage the integrity trap, and he documented that approximately 87% of people who begin financial awakening get stuck here, sometimes for years, sometimes for their entire lives. Stage 3 is characterized by a specific psychological predicament. You're too conscious to return to the old ways of making money, but you haven't yet developed the skills, systems, or nervous system capacity to generate sustainable income in alignment with your values. You're suspended between two worlds, and the suspension becomes your identity. Here's what makes stage 3 so psychologically complex. You're not in stage 1's unconsciousness anymore. You see clearly how most industries operate on exploitation, how marketing often manipulates rather than serves, how corporate structures reward the loudest rather than the most truthful. This clarity feels like moral superiority, and in some ways it is a form of evolutionary consciousness. But consciousness without capacity becomes paralysis. You know you can't participate in systems that violate your integrity, but you haven't yet built the psychological foundation to create alternatives that actually support you financially. Jung observed specific patterns in people trapped at stage 3. They develop elaborate justifications for their financial struggles. They tell themselves and others that they're too conscious for conventional success, too sensitive for the marketplace, too evolved for capitalism's games. These aren't entirely wrong, but they're incomplete. What Jung discovered is that stage 3 people are using their consciousness as a defense against the deeper work their psyche is demanding. They're conscious enough to see the problems in existing systems, but not yet conscious enough to see the problems in themselves, the childhood wounds around visibility, the nervous system patterns that interpret success as danger, the shadow beliefs about money and power that remain unexamined. Stage 3 has a specific emotional signature that Jung documented across dozens of patients. It's a combination of righteous anger at unjust systems and secret shame about personal inability to thrive. You're angry that the world rewards unconsciousness and punishes integrity. That anger is valid, but underneath that anger is a quieter, more painful belief that maybe you're not actually capable, that maybe your consciousness is just an excuse for inadequacy, that maybe you're fooling yourself about having gifts the world needs. This shame rarely gets spoken because it contradicts the stage 3 identity of being too evolved for conventional success. What makes stage 3 the most dangerous stage is that it can become comfortable in a perverse way. You develop a community of other stage 3 people who validate your struggle. You create content about how broken the system is. You collect evidence of capitalism's failures, of corporate toxicity, of how the economy was designed to keep conscious people poor. All of this is true, but Jung warned about a specific psychological trap. When you make your identity about being a victim of systemic forces, you abdicate your power to change your relationship with those forces. You become so invested in the story of why you can't succeed that you unconsciously sabotage the moments when success becomes possible. Jung documented that stage 3 people often experience what he called the poverty consciousness paradox. They claim to want financial abundance, but when opportunities arise that could generate significant income, they find reasons to reject them. The client seems too corporate. The project doesn't feel aligned enough. The pricing requires them to be visible in ways that trigger old wounds. These aren't always wrong assessments. Sometimes the opportunities genuinely violate integrity, but Jung noticed a pattern. Stage 3 people reject opportunities at a rate that suggests the rejection itself serves a psychological function. It allows them to maintain their identity as too conscious for this world, while avoiding the terrifying vulnerability of actually succeeding and having to integrate that success into their self-concept. Here's where Jung's framework reveals why most people never escape stage 3. The transition from stage 3 to stage 4 requires something that feels like psychological death. You have to release the identity of being the person who's too conscious to succeed. You have to confront the reality that your consciousness, while real and valuable, has also been a shield protecting you from deeper fears about your worthiness, your capacity, your right to take up space, and be compensated for your gifts. This confrontation is so painful that most people would rather remain stuck at stage 3, collecting evidence for why the system is broken, than face the possibility that they're also participating in their own stuckness. But before we explore how to break through stage 3 and enter stage 4, I want you to be completely honest with yourself. If you've been stuck for years knowing you can't do the old way, but unable to build the new way, if you've developed elaborate theories about why conscious people struggle financially, if you've rejected opportunities because they didn't feel pure enough, even though you desperately need income, write stage 3 in the comments. Jung believed that naming your stage without judgment is the first step toward moving through it. You're not stuck because you're broken. You're stuck because you're trying to skip the psychological work that stage 4 demands. Stage 4 is what Jung called the integration, and it's characterized by a shift so fundamental that it changes not just your relationship with money, but your entire psychological structure. In stage 4, you stop seeing your financial struggle as evidence that the world is broken, and start seeing it as information about what still needs to be integrated within your own psyche. This doesn't mean accepting exploitation or compromising your integrity. It means bringing the same level of consciousness you've applied to critiquing external systems to examining your internal patterns. Jung observed that stage 4 begins with a specific recognition. Your childhood money wounds are still running the show. Those moments when your family made you feel that love was conditional on performance, when worth had a price tag, when visibility felt dangerous. Those moments created neural pathways that still govern your adult relationship with income. Stage 4 is where you stop being a victim of those wounds and start being responsible for integrating them. This integration isn't a weekend workshop project. It's a sustained practice of noticing when old patterns arise and making different choices even when those choices feel terrifying. What makes stage 4 so difficult is that it requires you to hold two seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously. Yes, economic systems are designed to reward unconsciousness and extract compliance. And yes, you still have personal responsibility for building a life that supports you financially. Stage 3 people can only hold one truth at a time. They see the systemic problems and use them to explain their personal struggles. Stage 4 people develop what Jung called psychological both-and capacity. They see the systemic problems clearly, and they examine their own participation in those problems without collapsing into either self-blame or victim consciousness. Jung documented specific practices that characterize stage 4 consciousness. You start tracking your nervous system responses around money. When an opportunity arises that could be lucrative, instead of immediately finding reasons to reject it, you pause and notice what's happening in your body. Is this a genuine integrity boundary, or is this an old wound that interprets visibility as danger? You begin to distinguish between spiritual discernment and trauma responses disguised as intuition. This distinction is everything because it allows you to make choices from wisdom rather than from unexamined fear. Stage 4 is also where you begin serious shadow work around money and power. You examine the parts of yourself that secretly enjoy being broke because it confirms your moral superiority. You confront the ways you've used financial struggle as a shield against having to fully show up and risk rejection at scale. You look directly at the beliefs you inherited from your family about what it means to be wealthy, to be visible, to be successful, and you consciously choose which beliefs to keep and which to release. This shadow work isn't comfortable. It reveals how much you've been participating in your own stuckness, how much you've used consciousness as an excuse to avoid the vulnerability of actually building something. Here's what Jung found most remarkable about people who genuinely enter stage 4. Their financial situations often start improving, not because they're working harder or compromising their integrity, but because they're no longer unconsciously sabotaging opportunities. They stop undercharging because they've healed the wound that equated low prices with humility. They stop hiding because they've integrated the fear that visibility equals danger. They stop rejecting clients who have money because they've confronted their shadow beliefs about wealth and worthiness. The external circumstances shift because the internal structure has shifted, but stage 4 has another crucial element that Jung emphasized. You have to develop what he called practical skills in ethical income generation. Stage 3 people often have a fantasy that once they heal their wounds, money will just flow. Stage 4 people understand that healing wounds creates capacity, but capacity still needs to be directed through practical systems. You have to learn how to price your services in ways that honor both your needs and your client's transformation. You have to build systems that allow you to deliver your gifts without burning out. You have to develop boundaries that protect your energy while still being generous with your knowledge. Jung observed that stage 4 people often go through a phase he called the practical education period. They study how ethical businesses actually function. They learn about marketing that serves rather than manipulates. They understand that visibility isn't vanity, it's how you become findable by people who need what you offer. They develop financial literacy, not as a capitulation to materialism, but as a tool for sustaining their mission long term. This practical education feels boring to stage 3 people who are still invested in the romance of conscious poverty. But stage 4 people understand that integrity without sustainability is just another form of self-destruction. What makes stage 4 the crucial turning point is that it's where you stop waiting for the world to change before you can thrive. You see the systemic problems clearly. You work toward collective change where you can, but you also accept responsibility for building your own sustainable path within systems that are imperfect. This acceptance isn't defeat, it's maturity. It's the recognition that you can't dismantle systems while being financially dependent on them, and you can't build alternatives if you're too broke and broken to sustain your own work. Jung documented that stage 4 typically lasts between 18 months and 3 years of sustained practice. It's not a quick transformation because you're literally rewiring neural pathways, building new skills, and developing nervous system capacity that didn't exist before. But people who genuinely commit to stage 4 work begin to notice specific shifts. Money conversations feel less charged, pricing feels clearer. Opportunities that would have triggered paralysis in stage 3 now just feel like information to assess. The relationship with money becomes less about identity and more about exchange. You're not trying to prove your worth through your income or your lack of income. You're simply building sustainable systems that support your work in the world. If you recognize yourself in stage 4, if you're done with the righteousness of stage 3 and ready for the uncomfortable but necessary integration work, write stage 4 in the comments and share one wound you're actively working to integrate. Jung believed that community acknowledgement of shadow work weakens the shadow's power. You don't have to do this alone, and naming what you're integrating helps others recognize their own patterns. Stage 5 is what Jung called psychological sovereignty, and he documented that fewer than 5% of people who begin financial awakening actually reach this stage. Not because it's impossible, but because most people get comfortable with their discomfort somewhere in stages 2, 3, or 4. Stage 5 is characterized by a specific psychological signature. You've integrated enough of your wounds that money no longer triggers your survival responses. You've developed enough practical skills that you can generate sustainable income without violating your integrity. Most importantly, you've released the need for your financial situation to prove anything about your worth, your consciousness, or your place in the world. What makes stage 5 different from every previous stage is the quality of inner authority you've developed. In stage 1, external authorities told you what success meant. In stage 2, you rejected those authorities, but didn't yet have internal clarity. In stage 3, You developed ideological rigidity about what you would and wouldn't do. In stage 4, you softened that rigidity and built practical capacity. In stage 5, you've moved beyond ideology entirely into what Jung called embodied wisdom. You know, in your body and your experience, what serves life and what doesn't. And you make choices from that knowing without needing to defend or explain yourself. Jung observed that stage 5 people have a paradoxical relationship with financial success. They're often more successful by conventional measures than stage 1 people, but they hold that success lightly. Money becomes a tool for sustaining their work and supporting the people and causes they care about, not a measure of their worth or a source of their security. They can engage with economic systems without being captured by those systems. They can generate significant income without compromising the integrity that made them leave stage 1 in the first place. Here's what makes stage 5 consciousness so rare and so valuable. Stage 5 people become what Jung called bridge builders between unconscious and conscious economic participation. They demonstrate that you don't have to choose between integrity and income, between consciousness and capacity, between spiritual development and material sustainability. They prove by their existence that the binary stage 3 people cling to, that you're either selling out or staying pure, is a false binary created by unintegrated wounds. There's a third path, and that path requires the patient, unglamorous work of integrating shadow, building skills, and developing the nervous system capacity to hold success without collapsing into old patterns. Jung documented specific characteristics that mark stage 5 consciousness. You have clarity about what you offer and who it serves. You can describe your work without apology or inflation. You've developed what Jung called psychological right pricing, where your fees reflect the value of the transformation you facilitate without being distorted by shame or greed. You have boundaries that protect your energy without cutting you off from genuine connection. You experience your work as service, not as performance or proof. Stage 5 people also develop what Jung called ethical visibility. They're no longer hiding their gifts out of fear, but they're also not promoting themselves from ego inflation. They understand that visibility is how you become available to the people your work is meant to serve. They've made peace with the reality that not everyone will understand or appreciate what they do, and they no longer need universal approval to feel secure in their path. This freedom from needing everyone's validation allows them to focus their energy on serving the people who genuinely benefit from their work. But perhaps most importantly, stage 5 people have integrated what Jung called the collective shadow around money. They understand that economic systems are built on unconscious agreements, and they've consciously chosen which agreements to honor and which to subvert. They participate in exchange, in commerce, in financial systems, but they do so with clear eyes and clean conscience. They're not trying to be perfect or pure. They've released the stage 3 fantasy that you can exist entirely outside of systems you find problematic. Instead, they're working within and alongside those systems while maintaining their inner sovereignty and gradually building alternatives for others to participate in. Jung warned about one final trap at stage 5, the temptation towards spiritual materialism, using your consciousness as a product to sell without actually living from that consciousness. Stage 5 people who fall into this trap become what Jung called polished personas. They know all the right language. They can market their authenticity, but underneath the performance, they've recreated the very split between persona and self that characterized stage 1. True stage 5 consciousness maintains integration, even when that integration isn't marketable or impressive. The inner and outer life align not because it's a good brand strategy, but because the psychological cost of misalignment is no longer tolerable. If you're in stage 5, or moving toward it, if money has become neutral enough that you can use it as a tool without it using you, if you've built sustainable systems that honor both your integrity and your needs, write stage 5 in the comments and share one piece of wisdom you wish you'd known in stage 3. Jung believed that stage 5 people have a responsibility to be visible precisely because their existence gives hope to those still trapped in earlier stages. Your success doesn't make you special. It makes you proof that the path exists. Here's where everything Jung discovered about these 5 stages comes together into something you can actually use starting tonight. The stages aren't purely linear. You can spiral through them multiple times in different areas of life. You might be at stage 5 with your primary income and stage 2 with a creative project you haven't figured out how to monetize. You might reach stage 4 in your personal healing and then hit a setback that temporarily drops you back into stage 3 consciousness. This isn't failure. It's how psychological development actually works. The spiral is the path. What matters is developing the capacity to recognize which stage you're in at any given moment and what that stage is asking from you. Stage 1 asks for awareness. Notice the cost of your compliance. Stage 2 asks for courage. Don't retreat when the awakening gets uncomfortable. Stage 3 asks for honesty. Stop using consciousness as a defense against examining your own participation in your struggles. Stage 4 asks for integration. Do the actual shadow work your psyche has been demanding. Stage 5 asks for embodiment. Live what you've learned without needing it to prove anything. Jung's final insight about financial awakening was perhaps his most important. The goal isn't to reach stage 5 and stay there permanently. The goal is to develop enough psychological flexibility that you can move through all 5 stages with increasing speed and grace as new challenges arise. Financial awakening isn't a destination, it's a capacity. The capacity to notice when you're out of alignment with your values, to confront the psychological patterns keeping you stuck, to build practical skills that support your integrity, and to hold success without losing yourself in it. So here's the question Jung would ask you. Not which stage are you in, though that's useful information. The real question is, what is this stage teaching you that you've been refusing to learn? Stage 1 teaches you the cost of unconsciousness. Stage 2 teaches you that you can't unknow what you've seen. Stage 3 teaches you that consciousness without capacity is just another prison. Stage 4 teaches you that integration is possible, but not comfortable. Stage 5 teaches you that sovereignty is something you practice, not something you achieve once and keep forever. What are you learning right now? And are you willing to let that lesson change you? Your financial awakening isn't separate from your psychological development. It's not separate from your spiritual journey, or your relationships, or your health. Jung understood what modern self-help often misses. Everything is connected through the psyche, and when you do real work in one arena, every other arena shifts. Your money struggles aren't a distraction from your real work. They are your real work, showing you exactly where integration is still needed, exactly where old wounds still govern your choices, exactly where consciousness needs to expand to include what you've been avoiding. The stages exist as a map, not as judgment. Wherever you are is where you need to be right now, but you don't have to stay there. Jung documented these patterns not to trap you in categories, but to show you that what feels like personal failure is actually archetypal process. Thousands of people have walked this path before you. Thousands more will walk it after you. You're not alone in the struggle, and the struggle isn't evidence of inadequacy. It's evidence that you're developing consciousness in a world designed to reward its opposite. If this framework helps you make sense of your own journey, take a moment to ground it. Write in the comments which stage resonates most with your current experience, and share one specific action you're committing to based on what you've learned. Jung believed that public declaration strengthens private commitment. You don't have to do this perfectly. You just have to keep moving consciously through the stages instead of being unconsciously controlled by them. And if this video gave you clarity or hope, don't forget to like it, so it reaches more people who need to understand their financial struggles aren't about failure, they're about consciousness trying to integrate. Subscribe to Jung's Mind for more content exploring the psychology of money, power, visibility, and what it actually takes to build a life that honors both your integrity and your need for sustainable income. Because your journey isn't just about surviving, it's about demonstrating that consciousness can compete, that integrity can be profitable, and that psychological sovereignty is worth every difficult stage it requires you to move through. Your clarity is currency. Your integration is currency. And yes, your work will be paid when you're finally willing to let it be.